And just to follow up, we actually do have complimentary courses sometimes, and so typically if we offer seminars, we advertise in here, so I've had lots of CMU students sit in on my, or take my seminars for credit, so we encourage you to think about that. So thanks, Chris, for the nice introduction. I'm not used to all this tech equipment, so I'm a little overwhelmed at the moment. But today what I'll be talking about is recent dissertation work by a student who just graduated, or just at least defended. She still has to file her PhD, but she just did this like the last month, and she now is at IBM Research. And the research is in the area of review processing, both the customer reviews you're probably most familiar with, but also educational reviews. And we're interested in the notion of review helpfulness, both modeling it and using it for text summarization. So I'm sure everyone has lots of experience with online reviews. Most of us now interact with them for our own personal decision making. So if we want to buy something on Amazon or decide what movie to see or what restaurant to go to, we often look at user-generated content to see what other people have to say about the place in question. Probably less familiar to many of you is that in educational context, there's also kind of similar behavior going on in the context of peer review and online grading. And while this is an educational practice that's been around for many years and people think has many benefits, it's recently gotten a lot of attention because of the emergence of new technology, massively open online courses. So in those classroom environments, typically there are hundreds of thousands of students, and a single instructor or an instructor and a few TAs can't possibly grade them all except if they do something like true false or multiple choice, which can be automatically graded. But if you want to have more interesting assignments, such as writing assignments, you typically have to either do automated grading, like automated essay assessment technology, or do peer review, where you're building on the students in the class to help grade each other. So while reviews are present in lots of cases, in context, there's basically too much of them to go around, and so if people want to use this information, it's often overwhelming. If you go to Amazon and it's a popular product, you might have 1,000 reviews, and you probably don't want to read them all. And even if you did read them all, you'd notice that they're of varying quality. So some are really good, some are really bad. It's also the case in academic reviews, whether they're from students or even from professional contexts, that sometimes you get really good reviewers and sometimes you get really bad reviewers. So we'd like to somehow manage the content, the quantity, and also in doing so, when you're reducing the quantity, keep the ones that are particularly high quality. So we're not the first people to notice this, and in fact most websites that do provide this review functionality let users rate the reviews with respect to things called helpfulness, and there are other terms, but helpfulness is one of the more common ones. So here's an example review where you can see that after you read the review, if you're a customer, you can say, was this review helpful to you? You can vote yes or no, and then the website will keep track of that, and it will keep sort of a running tally of how many people voted, and of those who voted, how many found it helpful. And from this, you can construct a numerical rating from 0 to 1 by taking the number of positive votes and dividing it by the number of people who actually voted. So the first research problem that this talk will address is, what if this data isn't available? So not all websites actually have this functionality. Even if they do, if the most recent reviews haven't been there very long, they might not be rated yet, and there are also various other factors that influence what reviews get rated, and so once a review starts getting a lot of ratings, more people rate it, so there's kind of a bias effect, so there might be other reasons, even if it is manually available, to supplement it with automatic predictions. Whether you get it automatically or whether the users provide it, people have once they have it, have been trying to figure out how can we use this information. And so one very simple way of using it is just to re-rank the results. So if you're looking at a review, so here's something about, talking about iPods, iPads and things. Here are the list of reviews. You can order it chronologically, so that's kind of the default ordering, but now that we have this helpfulness information, some sites let you reorder them in terms of helpfulness. So that's one very simple way to use it. But even though it's reordered, if you wanted to actually be comprehensive, you'd still have to read lots of things. So a different approach would be not to just reorder them, but also to summarize them. So instead of reordering maybe 1,000 reviews and let's say 900 of them are considered helpful, so you'd still maybe want to read the 900, is that we have a text summarizer, condense that so you only have to read a short text, which basically, hopefully if it's done properly, would give you the useful information from those 900 reviews, but you'd have to spend a lot less time reading it to get the same information. Okay, so with that brief introduction of the two problems I'll be talking about and why they're kind of interesting from real-world application perspectives, I'll next talk about, putting on my natural language processing hat, why these pose challenges for the field if you were to just try to apply off-the-shelf technology from related areas to these particular applications. I'll then, and hopefully you'll keep those challenges in mind, talk about our approaches to answering these two research questions. In the first half of the talk, I'll be talking about review content analysis for helpfulness predictions. How do we predict helpfulness automatically? And I'll talk about two studies that we've done in that domain. And I'll then turn to, assuming we have helpfulness, whether predicted or directly from the user content, how can we use it to improve existing text summarization algorithms? Okay, so why are these problems challenging for language technologies, natural language processing research? So one problem is that helpfulness is not really defined. When you see that question on Amazon, was this review helpful? Nobody's telling you what helpfulness means. And what helpfulness might mean when you're looking at a movie is probably very different what helpfulness might mean when you're reviewing somebody's peer review. So if you get some feedback from a student and are told to give them feedback saying, was this useful information for you, probably how you're instantiating the meaning of helpfulness is very different. Okay, and just to give you some concrete examples, at the top here, these are two product reviews. At the top we have one that people found very helpful. 313 of 360 people found it very helpful, and at the bottom we have one that only 3 people out of 102 found helpful. And it's not clear what's making them helpful, but you can get a sense of like the characteristics of this domain. So helpful ones, typically people are talking about personal experience, they're talking about characteristics of the product that people typically care about, while this one that's not helpful is more of a flame. It's just saying that they're ripping off, that Amazon's ripping off Apple. In contrast, if we look at examples from a peer review application where we again have 2 reviews, this one is very helpful, that's the highest score it could have gotten, and this one is less helpful, it's almost at the bottom of the score. We can again see that intuitively to us they're different, but the things that distinguish these 2 ratings are kind of very different properties than in the customer reviews. So in educational reviews, things that have been shown in cognitive science work where people have tried to look at different ways to code reviews and see what causes students to actually act on them and take the feedback and revise their papers accordingly. So that's kind of a way of operationalizing helpfulness. They found that constructive criticism is a good thing. While people like to get praise and it makes you feel good, it's not really helpful for improving your paper. So instead, criticism is usually good. So this review starts with a criticism. I thought there were good opportunities to strengthen your argument. And then once they give criticism, they ground it and make it very clear where the paper is being criticized so that the person who's getting the review knows exactly what they're talking about. So here they're localizing the criticism, saying the statement, and giving exact quotes so they can find where the problem is. And not only do they tell people where the problem is, but they give them some suggestions on how to fix it and what's going on with that. Okay, a second problem, or potential problem, at least in some of the domains we're looking at, all sentences in a review are not created equal. They serve different functions, and the different functions might have different utility with respect to their role for predicting and using helpfulness. So we're going to use the terminology external and internal content. So here's a review from the camera, and you can see there are parts of the review that actually talk about the camera, and that's shown in green, and then there are parts of the review that are actually more review-bearing content. In movie reviews, we see the same thing. When you're giving a movie review, review, some of it is usually talking about the movie, and then that's shown again in green, and others then are evaluating that. And in peer review of papers, this was in a corpus of history papers around the Civil War time, so some of the reviews actually talking about Abraham Lincoln and some properties of history, and the other parts are actually talking about the more review-oriented content. So it seems that just treating all text equally in our algorithms might not be taking advantage of potentially useful information. A third problem is that, at least as currently implemented in most websites, review helpfulness ratings are at a very coarse granularity. So here's an example of a review from Amazon on the camera, and people are asked to review this whole chunk of text, which is basically a paragraph, rather than to review the helpfulness of the individual sentences. And we feel that it's probably more useful if we could somehow get finer grained ratings, for example, sentence by sentence, because if we knew that some sentences were more helpful than others, it might be useful for later tasks such as summarization, where we would only consider the more helpful sentences, but unfortunately we're not getting that in the original metadata. Some other problems that I'll talk in more detail about later are that most summarization work has not focused on text-like review content. Originally, it was largely focused on newspaper articles, and so a lot of the algorithms were designed based on findings from those type of corpora. And when you start looking at things like review content, which are very different, a lot of the heuristics fall apart, and we'll see some examples later. And then finally, one particular confound or difficulty with educational applications has to do with evaluation. So most of these algorithms in summarization are evaluated with human users. That's kind of considered the best way of evaluating it. And for customer reviews, it's very easy, you can imagine, to get sort of anybody off the street or use Amazon Mechanical Turk, because all of us are familiar with that. When it goes to educational applications, we've at least found it very hard to use the same sort of subject pools, and so that really restricts the type of evaluations that we can do compared to the more general cases. Okay, so again, I'd just like you to keep sort of, those are some of the challenges that will be framing the approaches that I'll now be talking about when we're addressing, in our work, to address these two questions: how can we predict helpfulness, and how can we use helpfulness for summarization? Okay, so as I said, the first part of the talk will be on automatic helpfulness prediction. I'm going to start by talking about our work focused on educational peer reviews, and then talk about a second project which attempted to generalize the work on educational peer reviews to a wider range, approach that would cover both customer reviews and educational reviews. Okay, so I got into, as I said, this area of review processing because, as Chris said, one of my affiliations is with the Learning Research and Development Center, which is focused a lot on educational applications of language technology for building better applications. And so I'm involved in working in doing peer review in the classroom, and so there's a lot of text going around that nobody had looked at before. So I became interested in looking at the feedback that students were giving to other students and the associated helpfulness ratings that were incorporated into the system. Largely they were put in the system to make sure, because there's an automatic grading algorithm, and if people were graded on their reviewing, they would take it more seriously. But, so that was put in the system, but once it's there, it's very similar to this kind of feedback that we see on traditional consumer sites. So our question in this project was, does that sort of larger field in NLP, would those techniques first directly carry over to this new context, and second, if they did carry over, could they be improved by adding extra knowledge that we knew that was particularly tailored to educational applications? Okay, so our work started with a corpus that had been collected for my colleagues for prior work on, as I said, looking at kind of from a learning sciences perspective, what makes feedback useful so that students will actually implement it and revise their papers to take it into account. So they had collected a college-level history class that had used this online software. It consisted of 22 papers, so there were 22 students in the class. They each wrote a paper, and then it was submitted. It was sent around to a number of other students in the class so they could review the paper, and then the students would get sent back to the original author so they could revise. And so each paper had multiple reviews, and so our corpus as a whole had 267 reviews. In addition to that, students not only gave text feedback, they also graded the paper, so they gave them a score. And at the end of the process, the original authors, once they got to read the feedback, they could grade the reviewer on how helpful their feedback was. And in this study, we're not actually using the helpfulness ratings by the students. After the data was collected, my psychologist colleagues actually hired experts, both writing experts and history experts, to grade the helpfulness, and those are going to be the gold standard for this study. So one nice thing about this corpus is it had a lot of manual annotations that were geared to sort of these cognitive science questions. So for every piece of feedback, it was labeled whether it was praising the paper, criticizing the paper, or summarizing the paper. And then for the feedback portions that were identified as criticism, it identified which part was pinpointing the problem, that's called localization in our terminology, and if a problem was identified, also did they provide solutions. And we saw that kind of example earlier. So this review has, the first sentence is why it's labeled as a criticism, and then since it's a criticism, we go on to label the other properties. The second sentence is shown in purple, that's where the pinpointing is, and the third part is the solution. Okay, so that's our data set. Our feature set, we tried to just use as, in the most straightforward manner, features that had been used in the customer product review scenario. And at the time, this work was published at ACL a couple of years ago, so at the time we published it, sort of review prediction even in the customer domain was still rather new. And as a baseline, we used one of the approaches that was had been published not too long before that. So in the prior work, they had a variety of features. They were sort of your standard natural language processing features that you can get fairly easily. The first column shows kind of a description of the class of features. These are the labels you'll see in the table, then these are the specific features. So you can see the first row, the structural features are simple counts of things you can get from standard tools, so number of sentences, number of words per sentences. We use straightforward lexical information, n-grams. We do simple syntactic analysis based on counting percentages of particular parts of speech. We have very shallow semantic analysis for our topic analysis. While in original customer reviews, they could get important topics from the product information. In ours, we had to do it in a data-driven manner, and we used some topic signature software that I'll talk about later. We also did very simple sentiment analysis based just on using some available lexicons. And then finally, in the product review domain, people typically use metadata such as the star rating, so because it turns out that people find that reviews of good products are typically more helpful than bad products. So we didn't have the star rating, but we do have the grading that the students gave to one another. So we replaced the stars with information from the peer review process. So those were the features that were in the literature before. Since one of our questions was, could we improve on that by tailoring it to, based on what's known in the cognitive science community, we added several features geared to peer review. The first set, which I'm calling cognitive science, are based on the manual annotations. So since we had them, we wanted to use them, and if they proved valuable, that would suggest predicting those would be a useful research topic in the future. Our data set, as you might recall, was only about less than 300 reviews. Well, some of our features, such as bigrams, were 23,000. So our feature space was really too large for the size of our data set. So we were interested in compressing that, replacing the actual words with categories. And so for these, we developed something, again, tailored to the peer review domain. And then finally, we actually have done work on trying to predict these categories automatically for other projects, and so we also added the features that we found useful for those prediction tasks as features. So we have kind of the gold standard annotations, but we also have features that are useful for that. Okay, so our first experiment in predicting review helpfulness was designed to answer the question, how did the first of these generic features work well in the educational domain? Second, how did they compare to replacing them with educationally motivated features? And third, if we put them all together, would we get the best results of all? Our experimental setup followed the original Kim paper where we got the generic feature set from, which used SVM regression as a learning algorithm and tenfold cross-validation to get the quantitative figures, and the evaluation metrics was a Pearson correlation, which is R value, where higher is better. And so here are the results. So here we'll see again the feature type, these are the R values, and these are the confidence intervals. The ones that are grayed out are not significant results, and then the best results are shown highlighted in red. And what you can see from this table is that, except for 2 features, all of our feature classes led to significant correlations. The best single correlation was this really simple counting feature. And our best combination of features was using the structural features plus the unigrams plus the metadata. Although it's not significant, we got a little boost. And while the single feature was different than the best single feature in the product review from the Kim study, actually the best combination was constant across both review genres. Another interesting finding here that is if we used all of our features, performance actually went down, but we believe that's due to the high dimensionality, as I mentioned earlier. Okay, let's now turn to the peer review features. So if we look at just the peer review features in isolation, we again get significant correlations for all of them, although the strength of the correlations is slightly weaker. So here the best one is 0.5, while on the previous page you can see the best one is 0.6. But even though they're slightly lower, they have the strong advantage that they're pedagogically interesting. So if you wanted to use these predictions, for example, to give feedback to the students on how they could improve their reviews, you wouldn't probably want to say just make it longer. You actually might want to tell them to do something like describe more concretely where the problem is, or you've identified the problem after the solution. So sort of quantitative performance isn't the only factor that we're concerned with in our algorithm development. And what you see then at the bottom of the table is combining all the features, the original generic features, and then some of these education-oriented features, and basically the main result here is that we get the best results of all by combining the 2. And furthermore, this non-additive effect that we saw when we started with unigrams goes away when we replace unigrams with this much smaller set of just 10 categories. And then once we do that, adding more features actually does help.
Sorry, Diane? Can you just remind us which of these features require tunability? Which ones were automatic?
Everything was automatic except for cog sci. Okay, so with those results, we felt our questions were answered that yes, there is a lot of similarity, even though the underlying semantics of helpfulness across education and customer product review is very different. So the same features, the same algorithms seem to work in both domains, and furthermore, specializing them to take advantage of particular aspects of each domain also seems to be a promising approach. But we actually were then interested, could we do better than trying to specialize and come up with an alternative approach to the original data that had several properties. And that's what I'll be talking about next, trying to come up with a more general model, helpfulness model where the model is restricted to only information in the text, so we throw out things like metadata. Okay, so the goals of this work were to see, could we come up with a different feature set, which would be based on features that would be available in any domain, and furthermore, that only were based on the content of the text. Again, because we were interested in using the results of this in other applications where it didn't make sense to use features like who the actual reviewer is in trying to summarize and figure out which are the more important sentences that carry the meaning. So I'll be talking about 3 features that we're going to explore that actually all come from other areas of NLP, but they haven't been used in the area of review helpfulness. And again, there are 3 different categories: language usage, content diversity, and topic modeling. These are the labels you'll be using in the tables, and each of these consists of a variety of features which I'll go into detail. So one way that we're trying to improve our prior work is come up with a more general representation. A second orthogonal approach is we'd like to take advantage of this insight that different sentences in reviews might be more or less useful for particular type of features, as we'd like to pre-process the reviews to identify different type of content and take that into account when we're extracting features and using them in our predictions. Okay, so the first set of features are basically trying to replicate the insight that we thought from the first experiment, that replacing the actual words with word categories both gives you sort of more meaningful and domain general hypotheses or models that you learn, and also has the advantage of reducing dimensionality, which isn't so much a problem in customer reviews, but is for educational reviews unless you're working at something like a MOOC. So for this, we used a well-known tool that's been used in lots of other studies called linguistic inquiry word count, which comes out of sort of the psycholinguistics community. And the idea is there's a small number of categories that you have lexicons, words are associated with that. The categories are psychologically motivated, and you can basically count them and then compute for a document what percentage of your vocabulary forms these categories. And here's just some examples, but there's, I forget how many there are, 70-something categories. Yeah, there's 82 categories. Our second pattern is based on work that's been used again in other areas on taking these notions of entropy and perplexity into account. The intuition here is that a review might be more helpful if it covers more topics, and one way of getting that besides topic modeling, which we'll talk about in a moment, is just looking at the word distributions and their entropy. And the third approach that we're interested in is based on topic modeling approaches. And instead of using straightforward LDA, which is unsupervised, we're going to propose using SLDA, which is going to use the review level helpfulness ratings that we're getting from the users, or that we're predicting automatically as a supervision, in order to let us automatically then assign helpfulness ratings at the sentence level, so to handle that granularity issue. And this, just to make it a little more intuitively clearer, is what the output of SLDA would look like in the peer review domain. So as in the topic modeling approach, we set a parameter for the number of topics. Here we've set it for 20. For each of these 20 topics, I'm showing the most important words for the topics. And what SLDA does is when it's creating these topics, tries to create them so that they're discriminatory with respect to our helpfulness rating. So you can see the different topics. Some are very negatively predictive of helpfulness, and some are highly correlated with helpfulness. Okay, so those are the three features. As I said, the orthogonal to the features is where do we extract them from, and so that gets to this issue of differentiating external or internal content. So in our work, this terminology is approximately that internal content are things that the reviewers sort of the core of the review content, while external is what they're actually reviewing, so the movies or the papers. And as we saw in some of the examples, we're going to show external content in green and internal content in black. So here's the movie review, and first part of the review is actually talking about the movie, and the part of the review is actually evaluating the movie. So this itself could be a quite complicated problem. We're doing a very simple approach where we're going to identify external content by looking for particular topic words associated with the thing being reviewed. And the way we do this is to use a topic signature algorithm that was proposed a little over 10 years ago, and some software that was designed from the University of Pennsylvania to implement that. So while I talked about topic modeling, such as LDA in the prior slide, which is the idea you have a text and you break it up into multiple topics, topic signatures is a different sense of topic, in that you have a text and you want to find the words in the text that kind of distinguish the general topics. You only have one topic there from other type of corpora. So the way this works is you look at your corpus and you compare it to a background corpus, and the things that distinguish it from a general background corpus is the signature. So for example, in movies, we looked at information that we could get from IMDb, compared to the default corpus here, which is, I think, I can't remember what the default corpus is, but it's something not related to movies, it's just a general text corpus, and it identifies this as topic words. So this part is obviously taken from Lord of the Rings movie information. For the peer review, we try to find the words that are associated with the student papers for this particular history assignment, and again, we get that by comparing our history papers to a general corpus, and these are the kind of words we get, the topic words in that particular domain. Again, this is about the Civil War, and things like that. Okay, so those are sort of the two techniques, new features, and feature extraction from different content sources that we're going to be exploring in this experiment. So for these experiments, because we're interested in approaches that will work across multiple domains, we looked at 3 different review domains. The first was the camera reviews. That has a lot of attention in the NLP community, and there's a corpus ready available, so we built on that. We collected our own movie corpus because we felt it was similar to camera reviews in that it was a product, more customer-oriented thing as opposed to educational, but it was similar to educational reviews in that the reviews actually spent a lot of time talking about the content of the movie, just as the educational reviews spent a lot of time talking about the content of the paper. So the thing being reviewed is sort of text. And then we had our educational peer review corpus. And you can see here's some descriptive statistics. So the camera review corpus, which was from the literature from Amazon, is much bigger. Peer review, that is typically small because classes are small, particularly ones that involve writing assignments tend to be smaller. And then the movie review, we created ourselves and created it to be the same size as the peer review, just to control for corpus size. You can see the length of the reviews differ, so the movies, people write the most about that, and then the peer reviews are shorter, and also the helpfulness reviews. Ratings actually vary, so the helpfulness of the product reviews are generally considered higher than the helpfulness of the student reviews, which are not surprising because they're students, they're still learning how to do this, it's lower quality. And also the way we created the gold standards was because the input's different, the way we had created the gold standard differs. So for the commercial sites, as I showed earlier, you basically vote up or down, and then we can create a number between 0 and 1 based on the positive, helpful votes or for all votes. For the peer reviews, they actually rate every review for helpfulness on some scale. In our case, it was 1 to 5. So the original values were 1 to 5, and then we normalized it in a range of 0 to 1. Okay, so for this experiment, we were interested in addressing different questions. First, did our features compare to baselines improve over baseline, and would they do this for all the domains? So that was looking at our new feature set versus a weak baseline of unigrams and a stronger baseline of unigram and the other generic features from the first study. And then the second question is how did these new features interact with depending on where they were extracted from, where F stands for the full review, I stands for the internal content, E stands for the external content, and I plus E means we extracted them for each of them and then considered them all together. We basically appended it. What are the internal and external were done using that topic signature algorithm that I described earlier. But the rest of the experiment was the same as the first experiment, the same learning algorithm, the same temporal cross-validation, and the same evaluation metric. Okay, and so here are the results. So here we see our features. So these are our 3 new features in isolation combined. Here below the line is the baseline. Here are our 3 corpora, and here are our values. And the bold line, which maybe it's harder to see, the bold values are the best result in the column, and then the plus means that this result is better than the baseline. Okay, so first you can see that for the movie and peer reviews, we're doing well with our new features. The best result considers all the content features together, and both that and some of the features in isolation significantly outperform our baseline. So what we see, unfortunately, for at least our hypothesis, is that for camera reviews, we get the opposite effects. This silly, simple baseline of unigrams, which often works well in lots of language technology applications, is also working well very here. And so we were trying to decide why that might be. As you might recall, the camera review was much larger, so we thought, well, maybe it's just working well because if we, the high dimensionality isn't a problem, then those will work, but we actually downsampled this to be the same size as those corpora, and the unigrams still work better, so that wasn't it. But we did some other analyses. Did some other analyses, but I'll talk about that in the later study. But this suggests that certain reviews, such as movies and peer, where, as I said, the object green reviews you considered as text, because there's 2 kinds of text going on, we believe that might be one reason these are harder to get good performance using just the unigrams. And for cases where the audio being reviewed isn't text, then unigrams might be more useful. We increased the baseline to make it a little harder by not only looking at unigrams, but looking at unigrams and all the other features from the first study. We found the exact same pattern. And now turning to the content source. So here again, we have the same set of our 3 new features in isolation by themselves. Here we have our 2 domains. And now what we've done is we look at different places in the review where we're extracting them from. So here we're, for example, looking at language usage features, as in the original study. Here we're looking at them just extracted from the internal, here from the external, and here we extract them both from internal and external and sort of duplicate them, but depending on the content. Okay, and what you can see here is that first, utility of the internal versus external content does make a difference, and it seems to make a difference in different ways for the different corpora. So for the movie reviews, the external content is much better than the internal content. We get higher R values. We also get results that outperform just using the full feature set, so not distinguishing the content. While if you look then at the same columns here in the peer review, you see that this column is higher than that column, and we don't get any significant improvements compared to that. And the best results, though, for both domains are when we compute features both from internal and external separately and consider them because they have complementary information. So in here, these two cells, there are actual highest R values overall, and they're both significantly better than our original baseline. Okay, so this is kind of the conclusion of the first part of the talk about predicting helpfulness, and what lessons hopefully you'll take away from this is that even though on the surface they might seem very different, there's a lot of similarity, at least in the utility of the techniques that one uses for predicting product reviews and peer reviews, and furthermore, by taking advantage of information tailored to a particular type of review, we can further improve performance. This is not only true for education, but other people, when they move to new domains, have found the same result. So that's one way to improve, is to try to develop algorithms tailored to each particular type of purpose. But if you wanted to do something more general, we also explored using features based solely on the text content, and found that they also work quite well at predicting review helpfulness, and can be even further improved by considering pre-processing the text for different type of context and extracting features selectively from the different feature textual types. Okay, so now I'd like to turn to the question of, once we have helpfulness, what can we do with it to make our interfaces more manageable, given the information overload and the mixed quality issues that I mentioned earlier. And to do this, there are many ways you could imagine using helpfulness. We're going to explore text summarization. So we're going to formulate our problem as a multi-document summarization problem, which means we're going to review each review as a document, and then the idea is to create a summary from all of these documents. And our genre is, again, online reviews. This has previously been a very popular approach in newspaper articles, for example, where you have different articles and you're trying to summarize from them. The approach of summarization that we're going to be using is extractive summarization, which means our summary is going to be created by literally lifting sentences out of the original data. And the goal is to pick the sentence which capture the meaning, the essence of the meaning, and avoiding redundancy. And typically, extractive summarization involves two steps. First, scoring the sentences to figure out which you should include, and then once you've got them, to rank them to make them a nice coherent whole, because you're taking them out of context. And I'm first going to start by just trying to motivate why we feel that we can't just use existing extractive summarization techniques for multi-document summarization off the shelf, by showing some traditional heuristics that are used in current implementations and how they don't really hold up when applied to our particular data set. Okay, so as you'll see, as part of our experiment, we first needed to create a gold standard of how would humans summarize reviews. And once we have these, we could then look at our corpus of human summaries and see what kind of properties they have, and were these similar properties that you would see in gold standard for like newspaper. So this first chart shows the average number of words and sentences in agreed human summaries. So we, in our experiment, will have up to 18 people given the same input and trying to create a summary. And you can see that the more words, like if 18 people want to use the same word, there are very few. If there's one word that's at least in one summary, there's a lot, and then if you need the word to be in two summaries, it goes down and so forth. And that's true both for the word level and the sentence level. So first, this is a difficult problem for humans because they can't even agree. Even though we had 18 people creating a summary, by the time we got down to 10 people, there was not a single sentence that more than 10 people included in every single summary. A second finding is that in prior work, people have found that humans tend to end up selecting what are high-frequency words in the input. And we didn't find that our humans did that. So you can see that basically the frequency from an absolute quantitative sense is pretty low, and these numbers are lower than typically seen. And also it doesn't really increase until we get to things that are used by all 18. So we finally see some of what we would expect, but not until we get lots and lots of users. So most of the curve doesn't follow that pattern. Another heuristic is that people find that sentences tend to exhibit similar word distributions, so the divergence of the distributions between the summary and the gold standards are pretty low, and we're not seeing that. So here we're seeing the opposite pattern, in fact, and again, we don't really see the pattern that we expect until we get a lot of users. And then finally, the last heuristic that we just computed to see how it worked is bigram coverage. So that's another thing that people have noticed. And again, here, sort of the salient point is there's no monotonic pattern that one would have expected. And these heuristics held up in our data. Oops. This is Chris's laptop, and I'll blame it on him. It was at that picture. Yeah. Right, so that was to give you an intuition of why we think we need a new model of summarization. We predict based on the fact that the heuristics that off-the-shelf technology incorporates don't work for ours, that those aren't going to be the optimal results that one could get in summarizing reviews. So our hypothesis instead is to try to change the core of the traditional review summarizer by taking advantage of this notion of helpfulness that I was talking about in the first part of the talk, and by doing so that we could outperform using the summary sort of summarizer straight out of the box. And we felt that this approach had a number of advantages. First, as we've already seen, helpfulness data is largely available on many sites. So it's easily available, it directly reflects user preferences, so we get around and trying to have to figure out what helpfulness means. The humans get to do that, not the computer. And even if it wasn't available, based on the first part of the talk, we believe we have ways of predicting it. Okay, so our approach will be to rip out the core of current summarizers and replace it with helpfulness. And we have two approaches that we're going to compare to the existing baseline. The first is a very simple approach of just filtering. So basically we can pre-process our reviews, we know which are helpful, we can sort them, and then before we send them to the traditional summarizer, we just sort of pick the best ones from helpfulness and then use traditional summaries on that. The very interesting way is to actually change the algorithm, and for the algorithm for content scoring to replace that by trying to predict sentence level helpfulness and then using that in the scoring algorithm. The data is going to be the exact same ones I talked about in the previous study for the customer reviews. As you'll see, we had some complexities with the evaluation of the educational peer reviews that I alluded to at the beginning of the talk, and so that we're going to have a different data set, which I'll talk about when I get to that experiment. But this is just what you saw before, camera reviews or movie reviews. These are the previous slides, and that's the same method for computing our gold standard of helpfulness. Okay, so as our baseline and what we're going to modify, we're using an extractive multi-document summarization software package that you can download freely from the University of Michigan called MEAD. And the content scoring is what we're particularly interested in, which sentences to extract based on the results of content scoring. This is done at the sentence level, and MEAD comes with its suite of algorithms and features for doing this. And some of them are shown here, so that MEAD considers the position in the original text, does some things with clusters and centroids and some other things, and there's a more sophisticated option that we also included to try to make this baseline as strong as possible. And what we're interested in doing is comparing this version of me to different approaches that use helpfulness instead. Since we're not interested in the re-ranking, sort of, which is more the after you figure out what to say, how to make it more coherent, we're not going to vary those. We're just going to use the same parameters for that in all of our experiments. So our experimental design was that we constructed 3 summarizers. The first was baseline mean, which I just mentioned, mean with its features and length rank. We did some filtering based just on length, so if it was really a short sentence, we did include that in the summary. So if it met the length requirements, it then was, the summary was created from the remaining sentences that were long enough using the standard mean framework. Our first helpfulness summarizer was this filtering. We took all of our reviews, we ranked them by helpfulness, and then basically cut them off at the mean. So the lowest half were not considered any further, and the top half of those were the ones that were sent to the summarizer. And for that, we also used the exact same summarizer with the baseline. And the third one, which we were most interested in and thought would work the best, would be after we filtered for helpfulness, we then replaced those features that need use with our helpfulness ratings, both the helpfulness ratings at the review level, which what we were getting directly from the metadata, and then the helpfulness ratings at the sentence level, which we're getting by using the supervised LBA and our algorithm based on that. And for all of these, we fixed the compression constraint so that the summaries would always be the same length, and we picked a number that was fairly common in prior evaluations done in the summarization community. Okay, so our first study was in the customer review domain. So we had 2 domains, movies and cameras. So those were between subject factors. And then for each of those domains, when a subject came in, they had to review 3 items, or basically create a summary for three items. So they were given 3 different cameras with 3 different movies. And their summaries were created from 18 original inputs. So we, even though there might have been more, we restricted every experiment that had 18 things, and they had to create a 200-word summary. And so here you can see, again, we see some domain differences that all the sentence length is the same as we saw earlier. The movies reviews are just longer to begin with. So we had 36 subjects, half assigned to cameras, half assigned to movies. We recruited subjects that hit on the web. They did this experiment all on the web, so they first read a scenario to kind of motivate why they were doing this. They then had to create a manual summary, and the purpose of doing this was to make sure they actually read the original 18 reviews, because if they didn't read the reviews, then they couldn't evaluate the summary. So this was a way to not only ensure that they read the reviews, but that then we also had this nice gold standard for evaluating our automatic approaches. Then they did 2 types of evaluations, which I'll now talk about. The whole experiment took from an hour to an hour and a half. Okay, so here's a scenario for the camera reviews. They were told that you're, imagine you want to buy a new camera, so now you're reading your reviews to help you decide whether you should buy it. To facilitate processing the reviews, we're going to summarize them. And you need to extract the essence of the reviews. You're going to be given surveys to compare the different summaries, by these automated systems with respect to how helpful they are for you to make your decision about buying a review. The first evaluation task our subjects did was pairwise comparison. And this is something people in summarization often do. We have the outputs. We have 3 different summarizers, and instead of comparing all 3, at one time they would compare 2, and we'd have all the different pairs. So I don't remember which algorithm is which, but they were given one summary and a second summary, and they were told which of them is more helpful, and then they had basically a Likert scale saying they strongly preferred one or they strongly preferred the other. Okay, and so here are the results. So if you're interested in the statistical methods, they're up here, but I'll basically focus on the results. So there were 3 different summarizers, so there are 3 different pairs that we could compare, and that's what's in this column. And then for each of those, we have those who evaluated camera summaries and those who evaluated movie summaries. The results are shown in terms of a mean, which if it's positive means that they prefer the first thing over the second, and if it's negative, they prefer the second over the first. And then these are whether these differences between the preferences were actually statistically significant. So the row that's highlighted there shows us that for both movies and cameras, our subjects preferred our helpful summarizer, which fooled with the content scoring algorithm over the baseline. And again, it's positive, which means they preferred helpful summary over the baseline, and both of those are statistically significant differences. For our other summarizer approach, the filtering one, the less sophisticated one, we also outperformed the baseline of the movies, but for the camera reviews, unfortunately, the baseline outperformed our approach, and it was also, both of those differences were significant. And finally, the last comparison, comparing the two helpfulness approaches directly, we found that for the camera reviews, people significantly preferred the helpful summarization over the filter, and for the other one, there were differences, again, in that same direction, but they were not statistically significant. So why did we not see positive results for helpful filter and the camera review? We were interested in that because that was kind of our one negative finding. And one thing we noticed is that the compression rate for that particular comparison strongly differed from all the others. So compression rate means basically how small is, what percentage, if you look at the size of the text of the summary, what percentage is it of the original input. And you can see for the movies, all of our algorithms gave about the same compression rate, and for the cameras, we also had mostly, except for this one finding here, which is the one where we got the inverse finding. And although we had set up the experiment so that we tried to keep the compression rate similar in terms of words, 200 words, when we actually created the summaries, if that was not at a sentence boundary, we would extend it or to include a whole sentence, and because of the different lengths of the sentences and all, for some reason in that case it made a big difference, and others have found that different compression rates tend to influence the quality, so we think there might have been a potential explanation. Maybe there was a confound for that particular condition because the compression rate was so different. The second type of evaluation we did was what we're calling a content evaluation. So here, instead of seeing two summaries and ranking them, they see one summaries and have to evaluate them for the quality of the content. And you can think of these intuitively as they're being asked to evaluate recall precision and accuracy in the standard kind of senses that those are used in information retrieval. So here they'll say, consider the following summary. So they read one summary, and then they're asked to agree, again, rate on a 5-point scale. For recall, they're asked to, does the summary cover all the information I would like to include? So basically, they want to make sure all the important sentences are in the summary. For precision, it contains no information that I would not have included, so they want to make sure even if you're missing something, if it's there, it's at least of high quality. And then accuracy is the combination, tries to optimize both. Okay, so for this, here are now the results. Again, we have our 3 different summarizers, our 2 domains, and our 3 evaluation metrics, and bold again is used to show the best results for each domain and metric. And so what we can see is that we do get some statistically significant main effects that show there are differences among summarizers for particular evaluation metrics. So we can see here that the camera reviews, there are significant differences for recall and accuracy, and in particular, comparing the 2 helpfulness-motivated summarizers directly, we again see that our helpful summarizers, which modify the scoring algorithm, outperforms the less sophisticated filtering, at least for recall and accuracies. But again, we do see cases where the baseline outperforms this helpful filtering approach. And that was for the camera review. For the movie reviews, we had, even though we saw differences supporting our approach, they were not significant. So these results are fairly consistent with the pairwise comparison. There are less of them, which suggests that if one had to choose an evaluation metric, the pairwise comparison seems to be able to identify. I don't know what is going on here. Okay. And this finding also, and others who have compared these 2 evaluation metrics, ways of doing human evaluation, have found similar findings that you get sort of more results using the pairwise than the content evaluation. That seems easier for people to do. Finally, we were interested in looking at automated evaluation metrics. So running a user study and having humans come in and evaluate is very time-consuming, expensive, so the summarization community has also developed automatic evaluation metrics, so you could potentially get rid of having humans do the work. And so we also tried that. And so for this, we compared not only the 3 automated approaches, but we also compared the quality of the automated summaries to our human gold standards. And again, you see our 2 domains. These are the summarizers. Now we have the 4th human condition. And these are Roost scores. There are all these varieties that you can use. So R1 means you're looking at unigrams. R2 is based on bigrams. And RSU4 is a more robust version of bigrams that involves some skipping. But whichever one you look at, sort of the findings are somewhat consistent. Among the machine summarizers, we can see for the movie reviews that the helpful summarizer again works best. So this is sort of the pattern we've been seeing before. I guess that's the major result from the groups. So we're not getting as many results with our automated as with the humans, which is not surprising. But when we do get results, they're consistent, which is good. Okay, so before turning to the final part of the summarization analysis, what I'd just like to highlight is our analysis for doing this approach was based on showing that traditional methods for for automatic summarization based on news don't really carry over, so we proposed new approaches that have several advantages, and both of our human and automated evaluations suggest the promise of our approaches in outperforming standard baselines. So finally, I'm running out of time, so I'll probably whiz through this part. But the last thing is, so what happened to the peer review? So as I said, we originally wanted to run a 3-condition study, not just movies and cameras, but we also had the peer reviews. And we started the study that way, and we found out that all the peer review, people being put in the peer review condition dropped out. So they'd come, and then they just wouldn't finish. They didn't want to get paid, so that was kind of surprising. And so because we couldn't get subjects who were able to do it, we just bailed on that. Pretty early into the study, and we decided instead we're going to run a separate study. We're going to get a different population for peer reviews. And to do that, luckily, there was actually a course at Pitt using SWORD that semester, and so we were able to get the instructor to ask students who were in that course if they'd be willing to sign up for this study for an additional task involving reviews that they were already doing as part of the class. And we were able to get 37 students in that class to sign up. And so for this study, every student got their own test set. So basically, they were getting reviews on their own paper or lab report. I can't remember what it was, but and we created summaries for each student separately. But they had to do basically the same things as before. We didn't make them summarize it because they were actually reading the reviews as part of their class, but we had them do the same type of evaluation. So without doing the manual summary, that was really the time consuming. These experiments were actually really short. We did the same kind of results, and as I said, I'm running out of time, I'll quickly just give you the highlights. So we first looked to see, did we see any differences between summarizers? And the answer is unfortunately no. And we weren't sure why. We think for whatever reason in this class, the assignment, the reviews were really small, so only about 2 sentences. So we think maybe that influenced it. As we saw in the prior study, the compression rate seemed to have an impact. So we didn't get any main results like we did in the customer review, but we were interested in looking at did student demographic factors maybe interact with the utility of the summarizer. And so we tried to collect information that we could from these students and see how those might interact with whether they preferred certain summarizers or not. So the things we looked at were teaching experience, had they ever been a TA, what their gender was, did they speak English as their native language, and other information about the quality of their writing or reviewing based on things that were available in the peer review system. So what was the grade of the paper that they themselves write, and how was their helpfulness grading for the reviews they gave, and how similar were their reviews to other students in the class. And I'm going to whiz through that, just kind of get to the results. So this shows some of the results when we actually take into account the summarizers interacting with the student demographics. Skip that one. So for example, these results show that students who have teaching experience, so this is did they have experience at TA, those are the rows that say yes, they prefer the helpful summary over the baseline. So you can see these 2 blue lines. The yes values are positive, and then some other things were students who had low ratings, so their papers, they were poor quality. They also preferred both helpful summarizers over the baseline. So if their value was low, the blue lines, they had the positive means, and these were all significant findings. So to sort of add to the first study, which was based on customer reviews, although we didn't see that human and automated evaluation results showed the utility of helpfulness-guided summarization compared to the mainline without considering any properties of the humans, which was the finding we had in the customer reviews. In peer reviews, we did see some benefits, but only for particular users based on things like teaching experience and their own skill in that particular domain. So what we're now working on is we'd like to combine the first part of the talk with the second part. So instead of using the gold standard helpfulness ratings, we'd like to see if we could predict the helpfulness ratings and replicate these summarization experiments. Would it be robust under those conditions? We also like to use some of the advances we made in the helpfulness predictions, such as distinguishing between content sources. And finally, although we somewhat did this in an ad hoc way by using it in the context of a real course after the fact, we'd like to actually integrate it into the software as part of the whole standard classroom paradigm and see how it works and how students are using it and what it might be useful for in a real classroom context. Okay, so to conclude, the work I presented, we feel contributes to several areas: peer review in language technology, or peer review in educational technologies, review mining in language technologies, and also summarization in language technologies. And I started off talking about how there's a lot of similarity between review helpfulness between customer reviews and peer reviews, which you could use sort of directly apply customer models to this new data, or else further improve it by taking advantage of specific information or coming and trying to come with alternative approaches that work for across many domains and but have the restriction that they're only using information from the text rather than from metadata. We then turned to using helpfulness by taking one of the features that we developed for the prediction, supervised LDA, to use that as an approach for going from review level helpfulness to sentence level helpfulness as the basis of content selection in a helpfulness-guided summarizer, and we showed via our user studies and automated analysis the potential benefits of the approach across a wide variety of review domains. And if you're interested in all the gory details, this is a much more complete list of sort of the research questions we answered, helpfulness to new domains, general helpfulness, and summarization. Our hypothesis, our answers were that we feel our experiments either fully or partially or give evidence to this, and this is sort of all the evidence compiled in one nice table, what the evidence is and how strongly the evidence is across our three different domains in terms of significant results from our experiments. Currently now, I'm working on 2 new applications of summarization based on projects that are just starting this year. So we have one new project where we're actually interested in improving undergraduate STEM education by developing a mobile app that asks students to reflect on what's going on in large lecture classes, like at least the introductory undergraduate physics classes often have several hundred people. And so one way teachers can interact with the clickers, but we'd actually like to have the students reflect simple question like what was the muddiest point in the lecture, have them type in something, and then have summaries automatically generated and given to both the students and teachers. So we're developing an app for that and deploying it, starting to deploy it this semester, and then we hope to run an experiment in a large physics class next semester. The educational domain, I also have a project funded by Google to look hopefully at one of their power searching MOOC courses and get the data from that, where they're doing peer review in that context and try to apply some of these ideas to a MOOC context because the quantity of data is much, much larger than my 300 reviews that I get in my history domain. And finally, I'd like to thank my collaborators in psychology who gave us the peer review data, people on the larger SWORD teams and my own research group, and the funding agencies who've been supporting this program. I'll take questions, and if you're interested in more information about this research, the ACL paper and the last work on summarization was just presented at Coling last month, so those papers are on the web. And if you're interested in peer review, our software is both being developed commercially and free, but there's a free research version if you're interested in using it and are willing to try out some of our software, such as summarization. You'd be able to use the software for free, and we'd be glad to talk to you about that. Thank you.
All right, we've got a couple of questions. I'll start off. I've got one. I really like the learning the sentence level helpfulness using supervised copy models. Did you look at, did it sort of pass the face validity test? Like when you look at the sentences that were identified as helpful, or you can approach it, were they, helpful?
Sometimes, that's the problem with all the, I think, any topic modeling, right? You look at them and they're always cherry picked in the papers to show the few words that actually make sense. So, I put up an example here, which went by probably pretty fast.
Right, yes, these were definitely, I thought the words looked pretty good, but it was more when you then aggregated these against sentence level score, you looked at sort of, if you were to say like you can ask the person to underline helpful parts of a review, I think, so
Right, well, I think I really like this camera, that's not helpful. So the ones that give the highest ones, to me these seem intuitive, but yes, that would be a good question to try to, so we're kind of doing an intrinsic evaluation of this. We don't know if this makes sense, but we're putting it in the system and it works better than not having it. But I think you're asking, could we do an intrinsic evaluation where we actually just stop here and see, have humans rate it and see if we're getting the same ranking or something? That would be an interesting question.
Comparing like different techniques for assessing helpfulness is a very approach.
Right, so that would be great if somebody wanted to do that.
All right, I guess, why don't we